Let's go to this third part, and then we'll be done for today. Now, what I want to end with are 7 different historical events that shape New Testament theology. These are things that actually happened, but the fact that they happened forced the church to form its theology. If these things had not happened, then the church would not think what it thinks about what it thought. Don't ask me to repeat that because I can't, because I don't know what I just said. But there are things that happened during the course of the early church that forced the church to think about how it would form itself, how it would express itself based on the happening of these things. Okay? First of all, the birth of Jesus, the incarnation. The idea that God could, well, first of all, that God would want to make God's self flesh. That's pretty deep right there. Secondly, that God actually did it and became incarnated in flesh. Now we have to deal with, what does it mean to have God in the flesh? Our concept of God is, God is everywhere, God is big, God is omnipresent, God is all-powerful. But if God is a baby, what does that mean? How do you handle the notion of incarnation, and how do you juxtapose that with the idea of that flesh also being God? So the birth of Jesus forced the church to create a theology that would give space for a human dimension of God. And so that's where we get this idea of the Holy Trinity. That's part of where we get it, because it's a concept of, now that we have Jesus, which is God in the flesh, how do we spread that out? How do we now interpret God? How do we now expand the concept of God that it includes that as well? I shared this formula with you several times, and I want to share it again so that you get it. In the Old Testament, we learn that God is for us. God is on our side. God is on our side so that we cross the Red Sea and the Egyptians drown. God is on our side so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego come out the fiery furnace. God is on our side so Joshua marched around the walls of Jericho. God is on our side so Gideon whips the Midianites. So it's hard to beat Israel because God is on their side. But when we come to the New Testament, we find something else. That just not that God is for us, but that God is with us. The name Emmanuel means God with us. And that's the uniqueness of the incarnation. That it's not just that God is on our side. God is actually right here with us, walking with us, talking with us, among us, one of us. It's amazing to think that God even cares about us. It is mind-blowing to think that God would become one of us. And that's what Emmanuel means. That's what this incarnation means, that God became flesh. God became one of us. Then secondly, a second historical event is the death of Jesus. Okay, the birth of Jesus was bad enough. All right, so now you got God being born and being in a manger and stuff. That's pretty deep. Now, you done killed God. How you do that? How do you kill God? That's a major theological problem. Okay, so I was doing all right. It took me 33 years to figure out, okay, so I finally got to the idea that a person could be God. Now you done gone and killed him. Now I got another problem. So it is as much of a theological problem to conceive of God being wrapped up in flesh as it is to conceive of that God wrapped up in flesh now being God. When I killed God, where if God is everywhere, well, where was God after I put God in? Who was running stuff? How can I think of killing God? And this whole notion of the death of God, this whole notion of what they call the crucified God, or patripassianism, which is causing the Father to suffer. This notion of the death of God is something that really helped the church or forced the church to think about who Jesus really was. That's one of the reasons why Judas had a problem. Everybody jump on Judas, and rightly so. But I really believe in my heart of hearts that Judas thought he was doing the right thing. I think he thought he was doing. I think Judas was one of them, one of them radical disciples. And Jesus wasn't moving fast enough. It's like, okay, you're supposed to be the Messiah. You're supposed to be overthrowing the Roman government. You're supposed to be taking over stuff. I see you got all this power, but you're moving kind of slow. You ain't had no rallies. You ain't got no buttons or nothing on. You ain't wrote no position papers. I ain't seen you on CNN. You doing all this stuff on the down low. And I need you to hurry up and overthrow Rome. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to force your hand. Because I know if I get you in front of Pilate, you're going to do your stuff. I know it. If I get you in front of them, you're going to do all this stuff and you're just going to take over the whole kingdom and then this thing will be done. Well, it didn't happen like that because he didn't understand that part of his mission as the incarnated God was to die. And this is how the church began to explain the death of Jesus, because they saw it as a part of his mission and not as a defeat of his mission. Okay? So the death of God and then the death of the Messiah. The Messiah was supposed to come and restore Israel to its rightful place, to its glorious kingdom. He was to be the king of Israel like David was the king. And so they hailed Jesus as the Messiah, and lo and behold, they crucified him. So what kind of Messiah was he? And that's the question that the death of Jesus forced them to answer. What kind of Messiah was he? What kind of king was he? Those kinds of questions were driven by the death of Jesus. And then thirdly, the resurrection of Jesus. Now, of course, there are many who would say that the resurrection of Jesus was not a historical fact. But, of course, we believe that is the case, that he not only died and really died, and that he was not only buried and was really buried, and he not only rose, but he really rose. Now, why is this important? It is important because, as Paul says in Corinthians, if Christ be not risen, then our faith, or my preaching and our faith, is in vain. He bases the whole of Christianity on the resurrection of Christ. Why? Because the victory over the death of Jesus is in the resurrection. Okay, I'll give you that God died in Jesus. But you got to give me, say Paul, that he got up. And why is this important? Because what was the penalty of Adam's sin? Death. And in order to pay the penalty, Jesus had to die like Adam did. But in order to defeat death, he had to overcome it and get up. So what Jesus does in the resurrection is not only pays the penalty with his death, as we talked about in point number 2, but he overcomes it and rises from the grave. And the victory that we have, the reason why we shout on the Messiah, the reason why we shout on Jesus Christ as God, is not so much because he died, but because he rose. Everybody dies, but everybody don't get up. It's in the getting up that he established who he was as the Messiah. And so we see him as a different kind of Messiah. We see him not as a Messiah that comes in and reinstitutes the political rule of Israel, but a Messiah that comes in and changes the whole of human history, because now we have a person who is no longer bound by the same penalty that everybody from Adam up to him is bound by. And even though we too may die, we are not bound by that, because since he's the first fruit of those that will rise from the dead, we in that same lineage as well. So death may touch us, but it still doesn't have dominion over us because we too will rise from the grave. Okay? So this notion of the resurrection of Jesus Christ is something that happened in history that forced the church to rethink or think through not only who Jesus was, but what his relationship was or would be to them. And then fourthly, Pentecost. That's the birth of the church. And as I shared with you on the day of Pentecost, when Peter preached, he preached and people heard him in their own languages from all over the world, but these were all Jews from all over the world. So while it was multilingual, it was still one culture, or at least one religion, one faith for that matter. I'm sure they were from different cultures since they came from different countries. But my point is that the people who heard Peter in the main were Jews. It was a worldwide diasporate or dispersion of Jewish people who now carried the gospel. That's what happened on the day of Pentecost. It was an international Jewish thing. You all with me? Now, on Pentecost is when the Spirit came. The Holy Spirit came. The third part of the Trinity. And the church becomes, just as Jesus was the second Adam, the church becomes the new Israel. The new people of God, as it were. So whereas Israel in the Old Testament was the people that God worked with exclusively, on the day of Pentecost, the Holy Spirit comes and he gives that same relationship to the church, who are now filled with his Spirit. In the Old Testament, we see the Spirit coming on people. In the New Testament, we see the Spirit coming in people. And in the Old Testament, God worked with Israel by moving them externally with his Spirit. In the New Testament, in the church, God works with the church by moving them internally with his Spirit. And so what happens on the day of Pentecost is that the Spirit falls on them, but not only on them, in them, and works through them to spread the gospel around the world. That's the day of Pentecost. So the day of Pentecost is really the birthday of the church. The day of Pentecost is the birthday of the church, where the church gets its own individual power without the physical presence of Jesus. It begins the post-Jesus era. The era where the church now functions not so much with the physical presence of Jesus, but with the spiritual presence of Jesus manifested in the Holy Spirit. Okay? Fifth thing, the introduction of Saul of Tarsus, or the conversion of Saul, who we all know as Paul. Now remember, I said on Pentecost, primarily the people that heard Peter were Jews. They spoke in different languages, but they were all basically Jews. What happens when Saul is converted is that the gospel now gets a proponent, an advocate, an ambassador, a missionary, to take the gospel around the world, not just to Jews, but to non-Jews. On Pentecost, it was still a Jewish thing. Even though it was international, it was just a Jewish thing. But when Paul comes around, it is no longer simply Jewish. It is a global, international, intercultural, interracial, interfaith, as it were, phenomenon. And we talked before about the problem that Paul had with trying to include these Gentiles into Christianity simply because they were not Jews. And you know how that plays out. Ultimately, it plays out that the Gentiles, outnumbered the early Christians who were Jews, and many of the laws that the early Christians as Jews kept were dropped or, not given as much emphasis, and the Gentile portion of the church is the church that has come down to us without the Jewish overtones that were there in the original first century. Let me give you an example. Um, People say, why is it that we worship on Sundays instead of Saturdays when Saturday is the seventh day of the week? God said, 6 days shall you labor, and on the seventh day you shall rest. Well, if you start with Monday, or you start with Sunday, which is the first day of the week, seventh day is Saturday. So it seemed like we ought to have church on Saturday. Well, in the early church, the Jews, the Jewish Christians, went to the temple on Saturday, which was a Sabbath, because they were still Jews. And they didn't see themselves as Christians or Jews. They saw themselves as Jews who believed in Christ. And so they continued to go to the Sabbath, they continued to go to the temple, and then they added a worship or a gathering on the first day of the week, which was Sunday, and they called that the Lord's Day. And the reason they call that the Lord's Day is because he got up from the grave on the first day of the week. Now, the firstborn of the dead gets up on the first day of the week. And so they had this meeting every Sunday where they commemorated the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So actually, every Sunday is Easter. Y'all with me? It's not just one day a year, but every Sunday. The reason why Christians gather on Sunday and not Saturday is because Jesus got up on the first day of the week. So now in the early church, when there were mostly Jews, then the Jews met on Saturday, which was a Sabbath, and then they had this resurrection meeting on the Lord's Day where they all got together as well. Well, when more Gentiles started joining the church than Jews, then more people came to the Sunday meeting than to the Saturday meeting. And the people who came to the Sunday meeting, because they were not Jews, were not required to go to the temple on Saturday. And on top of that, the temple was destroyed, so you couldn't go in the first place. So what began to happen was that because that was the Lord's Day, that was simply something that was dropped or phased out, whereas that was a law, or that was a practice that the Jews had that was dropped or phased out, and something else took its place. So if ever anybody asks you, why do we worship on Sunday and instead of Saturday, don't argue with them. Don't start saying, don't start counting on Monday. Well, I'll start on Monday, and that'll make Sunday the seventh. No, the seventh day is Saturday. But the reason we worship on Sunday is because it's the first day of the week, and that's the day Jesus got up, and that's what they call the Lord's Day. So we come to the Lord's house, take the Lord's Supper on the Lord's Day. In the book of Revelation, John says, I was in the Spirit when? On the Lord's Day. Well, what's the Lord's Day? The first day of the week, which is Sunday. All right? So when Saul is converted and becomes Paul, he takes the ministry, he takes mission, he takes the gospel to the Gentile world. And so now we have people all over the world from all different cultures learning about, hearing about Jesus. Not just Jews. And inasmuch as they are not Jews, they are not required to carry all of the laws of Judaism with them. And that particular wing of the church, the Gentile wing, is the wing that began to prevail. Now, you do understand that a Gentile is anybody that's not a Jew. Doesn't make any difference what they are. So Gentile is anybody that's not a Jew, and these were the people that Paul primarily went to. Number 6, historical event, the fall of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. and other persecutions. Not only was Jerusalem destroyed in 70 A.D., but the temple was also destroyed. And when the temple was destroyed, it made it difficult to worship in the temple because it didn't exist anymore. And all of the laws and rules that related to things you were to do in the temple, you could no longer do because there wasn't no temple. And so this is another thing that not only made it more difficult for the early Christians to keep their Judaism because the temple was actually destroyed, But it was also a problem to their faith, because people began to be persecuted. And they were persecuted because they were Christians. And this whole notion of persecution of Christians around the fall of Jerusalem, before, after, and literally for hundreds of years, a couple of hundred years, this persecution of Christians became an issue for the church, because, okay, if Jesus is the Messiah, why don't he do something about this? Why are we suffering like this? Why is he allowing this destruction to take place? So this notion of the fall of Jerusalem was a major blow to a lot of Christians, because they assumed, well, if the Messiah is coming back, he's going to come back for a new city, but y'all done just tore the city up. The temple is gone. All this stuff is gone. So they began to think and rethink in terms of how, now that this temple is gone, that we think not so much in terms of the physical temple in Jerusalem, but we began to think about how we too must suffer even as Jesus suffered. So I'm trying to share with you that this was something that happened in history that shocked the early church and forced them to think and rethink their understanding of what it means to be a Christian, and the degree to which it included being willing to suffer persecution. And then 7, you have the delay of the parousia. The parousia is the second coming of Jesus Christ. Now, the last thing Jesus said when he ascended into heaven, actually he didn't say it, the angel said it. Said, "Why, O ye men of Galilee, why you stand gazing into the heavens? For the same Jesus that you see going up, in like manner, is coming back again." Now, when them guys looked up and saw that, they weren't thinking that they would not be alive when Jesus came back. In their consciousness, they believed that they would live long enough to see Jesus return. But they did not. They died. And their friends died. And a whole generation of the original disciples died. And that started causing some stuff like, okay, now, we supposed to be around here when Jesus come back. What is taking him so long? This delay, the delay. When you read Paul, when you read a lot of Paul's letters, you must understand that some of the suggestions, directives, or whatever you want to call them, that he gives to the people that he writes to are in the context of his consciousness that Jesus is coming soon. It's no sense in changing stuff, because the Lord going to come in the next 2 minutes, and why are you going to change stuff? So he says, for example, in Corinthians, if you ain't married, don't get married. If you're married, stay married. Don't be changing nothing, because, in the twinkling of an eye, God going to be here. And people will take those words and put them in hard, fast, this is his law forever. It's not his law forever. That's his law, thinking that Jesus is coming back soon. If somebody told you you had 10 minutes to live, I don't think you would go down McDonald's and get a Big Mac. Why would you do that? What does that have to do with the next 10 minutes of your life? Knowing that you have a limited time, you begin to apportion your resources differently, because in your mind you're thinking, I don't have the time. And the early Christians really believed that Jesus was coming back soon. In fact, even in the book of Thessalonians, Paul says, well, I don't want you to be ignorant concerning those that have fallen asleep. What does he mean by that? I want you to understand what the deal is with these people dying before Jesus came back. And basically he says that we shall not all sleep. We shall not all sleep, which means I'm going to be around. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. Some are going to die. Some are going to die before Jesus comes. So all of us aren't going to live. Some of us are going to be alive when he comes. But when he does come, those that were dead are going to be raised from the dead. So that passage in Thessalonians is his way of trying to address the issue that Jesus has not come back yet. And lo and behold, it's 2,000 years and no second coming of Jesus. So this whole idea that Jesus promised he was coming back, he doesn't come back, is something that the church has to deal with and has to wrestle with. And one of the ways we deal with it and wrestle with it is to live prepared as if he will come in the next second, and to plan as if he won't. So we need to prepare that he's coming, but we need to plan like he's not. Okay, so I've heard this. Have you heard the second coming philosophy of bill paying? Y'all ever heard that? That ain't the title of it, but I've heard people say, well, listen, ain't no sense me paying the bill if Jesus coming, I ain't gonna owe it. So if the rapture happened before I need to pay my mortgage, ain't no sense to me, I can save that money. No. You live holy like he's coming in the next 10 minutes, and you plan to pay your mortgage like if you don't, you're gonna get put out. And that's the dilemma that we have, and that is, how do we live not knowing that he's coming, believing that he's coming, and yet having to live and plan our lives out together? And the way to do that is to live as if he's coming in the next 10 minutes, but to plan as if he hasn't been here for 2,000 years, it may be another 2,000 years. Because if you don't live in that way, you'll be surprised when he comes. And if he doesn't come, you'll be unprepared when life comes. And so this notion of Jesus coming back again, it is something that in the church we don't hear a lot about these days. In fact, we hear very little about it. There was a time, I guess, when most of us were growing up, we would hear every Sunday somebody talking about he coming back again, coming like a thief in the night. That's where those preachers always close. You better get ready, because you get caught with your work undone. They don't preach like that no more. You know why? Because we like the world. We ain't trying to go nowhere. Why should we go somewhere? We got air conditioning and 2-3 car garage, nice car, and nice little house. We ain't trying to go to heaven tonight. I don't know what them mansions look like up there, but what I'm living is all right. I ain't trying to leave nowhere. And these people who this New Testament was written about were people whose lives were in jeopardy. These were people whose property was taken from them. These weren't people living high off the hog. These are people hardly living at all. And people like that, they look to another place as a place to go that is better than this place. But a lot of us, we ain't trying to leave here. So we don't be talking about going to a better place. You know what? I'm going to stay in this here place until I have to go to the better place. Which brings me to this, and that is that in Christendom, we don't preach as much about the cosmic second coming of Christ, but we preach more about a personal coming of Christ. In other words, we don't talk so much about Jesus coming back for the world, we talk about Jesus coming back for me. And so instead of talking about he's coming like a thief in the night to change the whole world, we say he's coming like a thief in the night to snatch me or to snatch you, because our lives are like a vapor. And so what we've done is we personalized what was originally a cosmic understanding of the second coming of Christ. But that does not diminish the fact that we do believe and we trust that he is indeed coming back one day. All right, let me give you those 7 again. These are 7 things that actually happened in history, and because they happened, they forced the church to think and rethink what they believe. Number 1, the birth of Jesus. How could God become flesh? Number 2, the death of Jesus. How could God, having become flesh, actually die? Number 3, the resurrection of Jesus. What happened when Jesus rose from the grave? What rose with him, besides him? That would be us. The Pentecost, the birth of the church. The conversion of Saul, reaching out to the Gentiles. The fall of Jerusalem, That's the destruction of the temple and the church in persecution. How do we rationalize and deal with persecution? Being children of a God who loves and cares for us. And then 7, the delay of the parousia. How do we face, how do we handle, how do we live in a world where on the one hand, we believe that Jesus is coming right away, and on the other hand, we plan as if he will not. Okay? These are 7 things, historical events that shape the history of the New Testament.